Guruve Gaurachandraya Radhikaya Tadale Krishnaya Krishna Bhaktaya Tada Bhaktaya Namo Namaha Vancha Kalpa Turubhyascha Kripa Sindhuveva Cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasari Shri Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. My Dandavat Pranam devotees, all glories to Srila Gurudev, to Srila Prabhupada, Rupanuga Guru Varga. So, I'm doing a short video, as I always try to make these relatively short, in answer to a question that came in actually not so long ago, not too long ago at all, but that I did not initially reply to because, as I mentioned, I have a preference, obviously, to try to discuss or put on the table topics that are more directly topics related to our growth in bhakti, spirituality. By doing that, it's for my own edification that by repeating what I've heard from Guru Sadhu Sastra and having the ability to be corrected in any of that, by having it put out in public, it has been very helpful for me in terms of trying to grow in bhakti, as well as trying to render a service to the Vaishnav Mandal or Vaishnav community. So I've always given preference to questions which deal more specifically with that, especially if it is a time when there are things that are on the table that are very nourishing things to our growth in bhakti. Yesterday, of course, was the Tirobhav of Shri Gadadhar Pandit and also our Srila Bhaktivinoda Thakur. And today is also the celebration of Gundicha Maharajan. So there is, that, and then of course tomorrow is our Rath Yatra. So in our evening class on the phone, we've been discussing these things sequentially. And last Sunday, at my Sunday class that I facilitate, by the grace of one very nice devotee who arranged everything, a discussion near the end of the class came up about the issue of abortion, and it's sort of front and center presentation, elephant in the room status socially right now. And I engaged in what I consider very fruitful discussion at the end of the class on Sunday, and giving ample space to try to accommodate various views and opinions and so forth, so on, and then trying to find the points of absolute perspective, and then simply that's all we can do. You can offer absolute perspective, and then the way that people will digest or even codify it in their own minds, according to their own state of consciousness, is up to them. But you can only present what is the absolute perspective on something. And that's always healthy for anyone who's trying to aspire in bhakti, because when we bring things into the relative paradigm, everything therefore becomes exactly that, relative. So anyway, someone again wrote me and asked me to take a look at a presentation about various reasons why abortion could be justified on a particular site. So I took a look at the site and I saw the presentation. I didn't look at both presentations, I looked at one. And I commented on that post. And now, for the sake of answering this couple, it's a couple actually, their question regarding abortion, I want to first say that I am not looking at it, or I don't look at anything from any kind of either socially engineered or socio-political prism, because again, those are relative considerations. So I'm looking at things from the perspective of what is related to growth in spirituality. It doesn't even have to be exclusively bhakti, but growth in any faith in regarding trying to serve God. So I also had spoken to another small grouping, and this was outside of both of the things I just mentioned, my class and the article. And I was presenting, actually, and they're not really in the Bhakti community. They're actually a Christian community. And I mentioned to them that everybody is pro-life and pro-choice simultaneously. And what I meant by that is that everyone has free will because God endows us with free will to make choices. And God doesn't interfere in those choices. So everyone is pro-choice in the sense that everyone is pro-free will. But we acknowledge in our social interactions that someone's choices to exercise their free will cannot be something that's injurious or harming or interfering with someone else's choices and free will. So that's how you have a civil society. If the society becomes based on the ability to impose my choices on someone else against their will and their choices, then you have a society which is full of friction. Of course, Kali Yuga is hallmarked by this quality. Manda sumanda matayo, manda bhagyahu bhadrata. That everyone under the influence of Kali has the consciousness of always being argumentative, quarrelsome, lives are short, which creates anxiety and stress. So there is a very society that has very short fuse and is very apt to conflict. So choices cannot be something which crosses the boundary of your subjective feelings and imposes that on another person. So while someone can be pro-choice, everyone acknowledges that their choice has a boundary. And exceeding that boundary, it no longer becomes pro-choice, but it becomes the infliction of your choice on another person, which may not be wanted. So there are several examples I can use, but I don't think it's necessary. I think everyone can get that idea and get that concept immediately. Similarly, everyone is pro-life. If you go and ask anybody on a given day, except those who are under some great duress, stress, or some other condition in which they no longer value their lives, if you ask anyone whether they're ready to give their life up or not, most people will say absolutely not, because they are pro-life. They're pro the idea of living out their experiences. But because happiness even exceeds existence, right? If you take the principles of Sat, Chit, and Ananda, right? So let's take those two things. Sat means existence, and Ananda means happiness or bliss. A perverted reflection of that also exists within the material energy. So we have an existence here, and that existence is constantly a battle between trying to find happiness and dealing with unhappiness. But everyone has the idea that happiness is so important that it eclipses even existence. That's why people under great duress, frustration, mental conditions will give up their own life in terms of suicide, because somehow or another their unhappiness is overbearing. So barring that, if you ask anybody about the desire to live, people will say, oh, absolutely. So everyone is pro-life. So we are pro-choice, in other words, the freedom to have choices, and we are also pro-life. Everyone is. So now we have to go back and deal with the issue about when choice crosses boundaries. When choices cross boundaries that interfere with another's life, then that's no longer choice, as I mentioned, that's imposition. And when that imposition goes to the point of taking away another's life or the life process, at that point, it not only becomes an imposition, but we would, in civil society, codify it as being murder or killing or etc., etc. So when we look at abortion and we strip the conflated elements that are put on top of it, conflated elements mean these socio-political agendas, etc., etc. When you take all of that out and you look at what is happening, then we can have a real conversation. So what's really happening is that a life, and the semantics that start to get used around the idea of life and the life process is also disingenuous. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. In order to come to some rationale about taking the life of a child while it's in the womb, various semantics come up, right? In the name of science. Well, it's not really a life, it's a zygote, it's a clump of cells, it's this or that. Well, no matter how you look at it, unless you came here, and if you did, please put it in the comments because I'd like to meet you, unless you came here by Immaculate Conception, then you came through that process. So it is a life process. You didn't appear as a 21-year-old cute girl or handsome guy. You came through a process. And that process itself is also life. So it's not a question that we can change the semantics, relativize the life process, and legitimize or give some way out of what the facts are around what's about to happen. And what is about to happen is that we're going to make an aborting of the life or life process, depending on how you want to view it. So that aborting of the life or life process has now taken choice over the boundary of your own choices and imposed them on another life, because that life in the womb is also individual. That's scientifically acknowledged, that's spiritually acknowledged. So any way you want to frame it, your choice to abort a life is now crossed a boundary of choice in the God-given sense, and has now become imposition, and imposition to the highest degree I mentioned before of murder or killing another being. So if you strip bare these facts and put them on the table, you almost universally have agreement. No, this is not good, it's not correct. But when you conflate it, mask it, and put it into an unrecognizable mixture of mental ingredients, almost like a stew, and you say, well, what we're arguing about, or what we're discussing, or what we're debating is women's health care. So this supposes that the argument is not about whether we're going to abort a life or the life process, but we're arguing about whether a woman is entitled to a healthy life. So by masking the factual happenings with that statement, it makes the discussion disingenuous, because that's not really what's under discussion. Nobody is recommending that anyone, male, female, anyone else, should not have optimal health care. Or if you say it is a discussion about a person's right to have a choice, that's also not the discussion, because we acknowledge everyone has a right in their subjective space to make choices regarding their life. But when it crosses the boundary of your personal space, your personal existence, and affects another's existence, it's no longer your choice, it's now your choice making an imposition. And again, we're reiterating, the highest kind of imposition is the imposition that takes away another person's life. Because every day, many people make choices under either just, a violent mindset, or the criminal inspiration, or under mental health issues, to take people's lives. And we don't accept that, though that was a choice they made, that choice was all right, because it crossed a boundary. Similarly, we don't even, and this will also address an idea of bodily autonomy, we don't socially accept people taking their own lives. I spent a career in law enforcement, and I had occasions, not a number of them, thank God, where I had to speak to people. I was a negotiator as part of that portfolio professionally, and I do remember being called in to speak to someone who was about to commit suicide. They were going to jump in front of a train. So I had to sit there and go through a dialogue and a conversation to first try to get them not to react simply to what they were feeling, but to take some time in consideration of all the facts and everything, and try to have a different emotional approach to what they were dealing with, long story short. So the idea is that in our civil society, we don't really even accept people taking their own lives. So what to speak of the imposition of taking another's life? So when we're talking about a discussion, a fruitful and a real discussion on abortion, we have to first take the issue out of the coverings, maskings, and conflated, social political agendas that have been placed on them. Well, actually, because this is a particular mood of one paradigm of the political arena, then because I align with that, I need to find a way to rationalize it. Or if I'm on the other side, I need to find a way to rationalize it. To have a fruitful discussion, we need to drop both paradigms, put it on the table in the middle, and look at it for what it is, and see if we would still be agreeable to it. So, in this particular case, the issue at hand is not a woman's health care or a woman's right to choose something or anyone's right to choose something. It is a question of the life of someone who's an individual, their inability to voice for themselves opposition to taking a life. But we all know by the very intrinsic mood of self-preservation that if you went and polled a number of people at any given right to abortion rally, would you be agreeable to your life being aborted? Universally, I would have to say, people say, no, absolutely not. Now, people will start to give you rationale. Well, I'm a being, I'm a this, I'm developed, I'm viable, I'm etc., etc. But still, we have not gotten past, and even if you want to go back and start it at level 1 and say, before we make any decisions, let's define clearly whether we're talking about a life or not. Now, I thought I was completely clear, and I think all embryology at this stage of the game is completely clear. All faith-based understanding is completely clear, that life is present even at conception. But if you didn't accept that, you'd have to accept, since you went through that process, it is the life process. And if you abort the process, you're aborting the life. Right? So if you took things and you really put it on the table as that, would everybody have the same perspective on whether or not there should be abortions? Right? Obviously, if you wanted to be fair, we can't just make the spiritual imposition, oh, well, this is our belief system, and therefore, because we have this belief system, there should not be abortions. Because that's a subjective experience. So I'm acknowledging and I'm giving leeway to the idea that some people may not have that religious perspective, and therefore they're not going to accept the idea that abortion shouldn't happen on the basis of your subjective religious experience. Now, of course, for us, our faith, whatever it might be, is an absolute thing. It's not relative or subjective. But still, in the scheme of, life, so to speak, because everybody is not in the same place at the same time, for many people that is a subjective experience. But if you took still, no matter what vision or angle of vision you're coming from, faith-based or otherwise, if you put on the table the actual fact that you're aborting a life, then that may give rise to a different perspective on how you see what an abortion is. Now, when it is covered, just like in society now, when somebody dies, we don't take the body as it was when it died, whether it's natural causes or horrible accident, whatever it is, and have our funeral with the body put on the table just as they died. We take time to try to mask, because death is such a thing that's against the nature of existence, that in our human experience even, we socially want to kind of mask it. And therefore, when you go to a funeral, then the funeral director has done the body in such a way through the embalming process and all these other ways, made it such that people won't be completely disturbed by seeing that body of a loved one or friend or even someone you don't know. Right. But for instance, I'll give you some examples. Having worked in law enforcement again, I've had occasions where I've come across a homicide or suicide or something else, and when you see the body in those conditions, right, it's pretty shocking. So we tend to even psychologically mask anything that has to do with death and dying. So when we talk about, therefore, taking the life of a child in the womb, there's a natural tendency in some ways to kind of try to mask that. And that's where you get this alternative narratives and nomenclature. But when you bring down and clear away the pure facts, what we're actually doing is taking a life. Now, another question becomes, and if we have to come to this level, we do, but should it be a right or choice to take someone's life if that life is dependent for its initial existence on your body? And therefore, we'll have to have the conversation about bodily autonomy and whether or not I want to host the life process in my body, etc., etc. Well, here we'll have to then discuss choices which are pre and post that reality. So pre having to host a life in your body, there are several choices to be made. Will I have the process that makes life, which is sex? Will I have sex with someone? Whom will I have that sex with? How will I have that sex? And if you're not in a particular faith-based community, right? Because in a faith-based community, they may give some opposition even to the idea of contraception, etc. But if you're not in a faith-based community of some sort that opposes that, then even you'd have to consider, well, I have the option for using contraception, right? So, and then post the idea of carrying a life, I have the right not to have to maintain it. I have the right to put that life up for someone else to take care of that life. I'm not at all addressing what kind of emotional things may go on through that, but this is the reality of decisions made. And if the onus of the pre-responsible choices are taken away, which I would have the question why, how can we then allow a prominence of the alternative choice, well, let's just kill the child? How is that rational, reasonable, civil, or anything else? Now, other arguments are brought in. Well, you know, from this socio-political perspective, when life comes into the world, nobody wants to take care of it. Fathers are deadbeat fathers. The government's really not going to help you. Even those who point out that, no, they're pro-life, they're not going to really help, right? So is the question or the discussion really then why they don't do that? Or is the question that that's a reason enough for me to exercise the choice of killing the child while it's in the womb? And from 1973 to this point, that's been done in genocidal numbers. So now we start to question, well, is there other agendas at hand? Right? That we're talking about killing children in genocidal numbers, etc., etc. So that's a whole nother thing. I don't want to go down that pike. But here the question still remains, if you bring up those kinds of elements to add into the discussion, then the real thing should be why. Why are fathers not taking care of children? And why, in general, are men removed from the responsibility, even, of dealing with children and the idea of the abortion? Again, nobody came here that I know of. Again, put your name in the comment if you did. Nobody came here by immaculate conception. Therefore, a father has equal responsibility for the life of that child. And to give men a pass on that in the name of, well, that I didn't decide. It was, you know, she decided she wanted an abortion. Because karmically, everybody's responsible. You understand? If a murder is committed and you were a co-conspirator to that murder, you would also be charged with it. Speaking of which, if in most states, right, because there are some nuances, but in most states, if you were to kill a woman and she's pregnant, you would be charged with a double homicide. So law recognizes, and I know some people will comment, well, in different places, different standards, but in general, law recognizes that another life is present. So the idea here overall is that there is really not a substantial, when put on the table, stripped bare of all of the socio-political dynamics and all other kinds of things, when you strip that away and put on the table the idea of whether people are pro-choice or pro-life, everybody is absolutely both. The question becomes where choice exceeds its boundary and imposes on another person's life. And the child in the womb is another individual life. That is scientifically accepted. It has nothing to do with faith, religion, or anything else. There's a unique DNA code. Everything is individual. So now you've taken the choice into a realm of imposition, and imposition in the highest way, which is to take the life or abort the life of that individual. Right? So everybody now will have to take your post, put it on the table. I would ask you to strip away your socio-political leanings if you have them, and look at the issue for what it really is. And then decide whether it's something that you resonate with. And remember, if you say, well, I don't align with the idea of killing the child, but I align with the other socio-political dynamics. Well, sometimes you inadvertently support one thing while leaning towards supporting something else. That's why conflation of the issues is a problem. Because somebody may fully support, which is why I say everybody's pro-choice. If you said, well, do you support women being able to have a choice? What to speak of women? Anybody being able to make choices in their life. God grants that. You can make the choices you want. You're responsible for the outcome karmically, but God doesn't interfere with people making choices. Right? But if you ask in a civil society, is it okay for my choice to override its boundaries and impose on another individual? For instance, if my choice is that I want to take your life, is that going to be okay with you? And my answer would be obviously no. Right? Now, I may have the ability to defend my life, but for a child in the womb, they don't. Therefore, maybe someone has to advocate on their behalf for the protection of their lives, and maybe that's what the other side is. Now, I'm not saying that on the other side, everything is pristine and pure, because maybe there's some socio-political agenda behind that, just to be on the opposite side. I don't know. Right? Because my speaking here is not from a social or political paradigm. I'm just speaking straightly according to the, spiritual perspective, obviously, but also how spiritual perspective would play out in a society which at least has a foundational element of some kind of morality and some kind of consciousness. Even if it hasn't risen to the level of God consciousness, some kind of consciousness. So, anyways, I think this should be food for thought. And again, I would ask that people, again, if you're going to enter into the discussion, enter into it having hung up your socio-political coat at the door, and come in from just your personal perspective, humanly, on whether or not it would be okay to abort the life or life process for another individual. That's what the discussion is. It's not more than that. Everything else is, grossly speaking, smoke and mirrors, and at best, it's conflation. So hopefully this was somewhat helpful to that couple, which is, again, it is not my preference to have these kind of discussions. But I vowed also that because spiritual life is not just a matter of theology and even just practice, it's a matter of application in the environment that we live. So in the environment that we live, there are certain social dynamics that come up. And I said I would not shy away from or not address them simply to remain, quote, aloof from them or something like that. And because many devotees sincerely are asking questions to get a perspective, and that perspective may weigh in on how they practice, how they associate, so many different things, it's important to address the things as well. So, my Dandavat Pranam. People can feel free to weigh in. I of course, don't want any, comments that are simply not, comments of contribution to advancing the discussion, but that are simply either insults or simply political leaning speculations or conjectures and all that kind of that. I'm not going to deal with so much. Right? So Dandavat Pranam, devotees. Vancha kalpaturubhyascha kripa sindhuvevacha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Jai Radhe Radhe.